The story we're going to talk about today will turn 100 years old in a few days on Christmas Eve. Imagine a one-room schoolhouse packed with children and their families gathered to watch a Christmas Eve program. What would start out as a festive night for the townspeople of Switch, Oklahoma, would become such an unspeakable tragedy that it is still hard to imagine to this day. And did I mention that it also involves a missing child? Or is she actually missing? Let's talk about Mary Elizabeth Edens. I first want to take this opportunity to credit my sources for this episode. I originally heard about the story when my friend Robin Werder covered it on his podcast, The Trail Went Cold, so I suggest that you check it out. There are some very helpful resources online, such as one by Rebel Cherokee, and many old newspaper articles from when it happened. Lastly, I want to thank Justin Clyburn for speaking with me about this mystery, as he was very helpful. He has been working hard on research for a book concerning this incident that he hopes to publish soon. You can check out his website at jcclyburn.com. In these very old stories, it is sometimes hard to verify facts. I've always been more likely to believe accounts of the time, or in years soon after, than the ones that have made it to the internet decades later. This story is especially challenging in that regard, as facts closer to the time differ quite a bit on some facts than the articles from modern day. When I mention something that differs from the modern day telling, I will mention that newspaper article that it is found in. It was Wednesday night on December 24, 1924, and it started out as a very pleasant Christmas Eve in Switch, which is a community in Kiowa County, Oklahoma. It was during the holiday season, and the townspeople looked forward to attending a Christmas pageant that night with the 32 students at the Switch School. The teacher, Mrs. Florence Terry Hill, had worked hard to make everything nice, and the school had been festively decorated. There was a Christmas tree lit with live candles placed at the front of the room. Presents were nearby and were to be distributed to the school children in attendance after the program. It was cold with a little snow, and everything was in place for an enjoyable evening. People soon completely filled the one-room schoolhouse to watch the Christmas program. Estimates are there were between 200 to 250 people literally packed into a 26 by 36 foot building. After the program was over, 16-year-old Dal Bolding had the happy job of dressing up as Santa and handing out presents to the children. While giving out the gifts, Dal leaned over to take a gift off a branch on the tree. The limb was pulled down, and when it was released, it knocked a lit candle from the tree into some cotton and tinsel decorations, which quickly caught fire, the fire then spreading to the dry tree. Some of the attendees turned the tree over to help extinguish the flames, but it only served to spread the fire even quicker. Several people rushed to try and smother the fire, but unfortunately, it only made it worse. Soon flames engulfed the tiny schoolhouse, and it was sheer terror for the overflowing crowd inside. There was a mad rush for everyone to get out. Some of the townspeople were overcome with the thick black smoke that quickly filled the schoolhouse, while others were trampled to death before the flames reached them. In a panic, those trapped inside tried to open the windows to escape, but the heavy wire netting on the outside would not give. Once the windows were able to be broken, the wind blowing in then caused a draft which fanned the flames, only making the inferno worse. Screams were heard inside and outside as entire families fought desperately to escape the blaze. Those that did escape were in shock, and some of them were badly burned in addition to smoke inhalation. Due to it being a cold night, most people had drained their car radiators of water before the program to keep them from freezing. Many people were in such a hurry to leave to get medical attention that they forgot to refill their radiators and would need to stop at nearby houses for water due to their overheating cars. As there was no phone service to the school, it was quite a while before word could get out about the fire for aid to arrive. In an article from the Frederick Press published 2 days after the fire, it says that a Native American was attending the ceremony. He was burned on his face and hands and was able to escape and fled on his horse towards town. He became exhausted because of his injuries and fell off his horse. Some people passing by heard his screams and approached him, and he told them of the fire. Help was then summoned. The survivors were rushed to nearby Hobart, where by midnight they had all started to receive medical care. There were 37 survivors who needed attention for severe burns, smoke inhalation, and other injuries. Eventually, the fire was put out, and townspeople combed through the ruins all night in the bitter cold until every last body was recovered. In the light of day, the death toll of the fire was heartbreaking. There were 36 people that died in the Bab Switch fire. There were 32 who died at the scene, and 4 more would succumb to their injuries a few days later. There were entire families that perished in the blaze. The school teacher, Mrs. Hill, as well as the boy playing Santa, were both said to be heroes who tried to lead all of the children to safety before sadly perishing in the flames. A young couple, Claude Boulding and Gladys Clemens, who were to be married the next day on Christmas, died in the fire. There were 20 bodies that weren't able to be conclusively identified due to burns, and they were buried in a mass grave according to newspaper accounts of the time. According to an article in the Malloster News Capital published in 1949, there were 11 children who had perished in the fire. An article in the Pawhuska Journal Capital from 2 days after the tragedy stated, quite graphically, that there were far less children burned than originally thought because a great many of the limbs had been burned away and the torso that was left was mistaken for ones belonging to children. There were several factors in the schoolhouse fire that made this fire even more deadly. It was even stated that there couldn't have been more hazards if they tried. First off, the room was wood frame and only 26 by 36 feet. It is unfathomable that 200 plus people could even fit in there. The school had been freshly painted with oil-based paint, including the ceiling, causing a flashover. Due to damage from a spring windstorm, the new windows now had tight screens attached to prevent damage or vandalism. This made it almost impossible for people to escape through them. Gas lamps were used to light the building, which quickly exploded in the fire. The only accessible door opened inward, allowing for less people to escape. Lastly, there was no water nearby or firefighting equipment located in the building. It is also referenced in the Enid Daily Eagle on 12/27 of 1924 that unfortunately this was not the first time a fire had started in the small schoolhouse. It states that at 2 previous Christmas Eve celebrations in the past, the trees had caught fire but had been put out quickly without incident. It also tells of a story where last Christmas, William Curtis, who sadly perished in the 1924 Bab Switch fire, had been playing the role of Santa when his white beard caught fire, but it was extinguished quickly. It does seem like a pattern of mishaps, and although the reason for the horrendous fire was now known, there was one mystery yet to be solved. One person who was in the blaze could not be accounted for. Mary Elizabeth Edens was a 3-year-old girl who was at the Christmas program with her family. She was said to be sitting in her Aunt Alice's lap when the fire started. Alice had claimed that during the fire, she handed Mary out the window to an unknown person to save her from the flames. Unfortunately, Aunt Alice was badly burned and had smoke inhalation, and sadly died from her injuries a few days later. The family frantically searched for Mary Elizabeth Edens. It was said that she was never identified as one of the victims buried in the mass grave. The family believed Aunt Alice and thought that their daughter had been taken that night in all of the confusion, yet Mary Elizabeth could not be located. The country did come together and in a charitable act donated over $12,000 to go towards medical and burial costs for the victims. Some children from Muskogee, Oklahoma, even mailed their new Christmas toys to the children who had survived the blaze. There was eventually a memorial erected at the site of the fire, near the mass grave, with all of the victims' names engraved. However, Mary Elizabeth Edens was not on the list. Lewis and Ethel Edens were the parents of Mary Elizabeth. They lived in grief, thinking their daughter had been taken on that tragic night. As the years would go by, there would be women who would come forward claiming to be their missing daughter. However, it is said that blood tests would eventually rule them out. Then in the fall of 1956, 32 years after the fire, a man named Elmont Place would read an article on the Babb switch fire and wrote a letter to an acquaintance of the Edens about a possible match. Mr. Place said he had a friend who had confided to him that she never felt at home with her family and thought she had another past. Her name was Grace Reynolds. He wondered if his friend could be their missing daughter. Lewis and Ethel's daughter Mary was the one whom from the family first contacted about the possible match. She didn't want to get her parents' hopes up once again, so she sent Grace pictures of Mary Elizabeth. It was said Mary Elizabeth and Grace both had a matching scar on the arch of their foot. It is also said that the blood tests could neither prove nor disprove her identity. It seems that Lewis and Ethel Edens accepted that this was their long-lost daughter. Although Grace Reynolds said she had no memory of anything until 6 years old, she seemed to be convinced that she was Mary Elizabeth as well. The Edens even had an on-camera reunion on an episode of Art Linkletter's House Party that aired on February 10, 1957. The Edens family now seemed to be complete once again. But questions would soon come up in Grace Reynolds' story. Dorothy Link saw an Associated Press picture of the newly found Mary Elizabeth and contacted the Stockton Record. Link said she knew the person now thought to be Mary Elizabeth Edens. In fact, she was her sister. The newspaper then obtained a notarized statement on May 16, 1957 from Goldie Thomas that read, "Grace Leona Reynolds is my lawful daughter. She was born July 11, 1923 on a farm near Cotton Plant, Arkansas." The Reynolds family also claimed that about 10 years before this reunion, Grace had begun telling people that she had no family. When questioned about this, she said she would be less likely to land a job at a first-rate department store if people knew she came from a poor family. It also seems part of the reason Dorothy Link was angered by Grace's newfound family was the insinuation that their mother was a kidnapper. With this new information and seemingly irrefutable evidence that Grace Reynolds was an imposter, Ransom Hancock, owner of the Hobart Democrat Chief, now felt he had to show his evidence to Lewis Edens. Of course, Mr. Edens was disappointed to learn Grace Reynolds wasn't his long-lost daughter. It also upset Ransom Hancock to have to tell him the news. The newspapers could now print this shocking development. However, the story would not be published. Lewis Edens had asked his friend Ransom for a special consideration in this delicate matter. Fearing his wife could not bear once again losing a child, he asked that Mr. Hancock not print the story until after his wife passed away. Ransom Hancock decided to honor his friend's request and did not print the story. However, on the 75th anniversary of the fire, 42 years after the information of the impostor was found, Ransom Hancock's son Joe, now the editor of the paper, decided to publish the story. Mary Elizabeth's parents were both now deceased, and her siblings already knew the truth, so he didn't think it would hurt anyone. The true story of Grace Reynolds could now be told. After the story was printed, however, Grace Reynolds did not change her declaration. She still insisted that she was Mary Elizabeth Edens and even wrote a book about her colorful beginnings titled Mary, Child of Tragedy, which was published in 1980. Grace Reynolds would continue to pass herself off as Mary Elizabeth until her death in April of 2008. Continuing her claims, she even had Eden's name and birth date put on her headstone. The Babswitch school fire was the 6th worst school fire ever in the United States. So many mistakes were made, and there were so many fire hazards that helped to contribute to its place in history. Soon after the fire, many changes were made. The Fawkes Bill was passed that increased fire safety requirements for one-room schoolhouses. They would now have to have at least 2 exits, and the doors must open outward. Window screens were to be removable from the inside, and it was mandatory that there was a fire extinguisher on the premises. As far as my thoughts on this case, I would say I definitely don't think Grace Reynolds was Mary Elizabeth Eden's. Grace's birth family came forward right away to refute the claims, and my thoughts are Grace wanted it to be true so much she kept up the ruse. Perhaps she didn't think she was hurting anyone, but she did deceive everyone around her for selfish reasons. Sadly, I think that Mary Elizabeth Eden's did perish in the fire. Perhaps at her very young age and small size, her remains burned up quickly and were combined with another victim, which is why she was never conclusively identified. I did mention earlier Aunt Alice's story, as it is told in modern times, about handing her out the window, but the early accounts of the fire state a different story. They state that Aunt Alice, as best as she can remember, was carrying Mary Elizabeth outside and the little girl had not been burned. She then believes someone took Mary Elizabeth from her arms, but doesn't know who. Let's remember that Aunt Alice had horrible injuries, which she died from a few days later. It is possible that in the shock, she doesn't even remember what truly happened, or perhaps gave that account to give Mary Elizabeth's family some hope that she could have survived. It just seems more logical that she would have perished in this horrific fire. Remember, adults burned up so quickly they weren't even able to be identified and even mistaken as children's remains. So a 3-year-old child could have been consumed by the fire in a very short amount of time. It appears that most everyone at the program were townsfolk and would most certainly know who Mary Elizabeth belonged to and that her parents had survived the fire, so I don't believe the theory that she could have been taken. Another thing I found in my research that I want to mention. In articles in the Elk City News-Democrat and the Chickasaw Daily Express, both printed just a few days after the fire, they talked about Jim Revel. He had gone to Waco to visit family and had left 4 of his children locally with friends. He had come to claim 2 of his children who he believed to have died in the fire. He was able to identify his young son by his shoes. However, he couldn't conclusively identify his daughter and claim the last body as hers because it hadn't been claimed by anyone else. I'm unsure of his daughter's age, but is there a chance that body could have been Mary Elizabeth Eden's? It's hard to imagine that tragic night 100 years ago when such a joyous event turned into absolute panic and so much death in just a matter of minutes. The details being so terrible, it has rightly earned its place in Oklahoma history. Without any type of DNA testing and a mystery being now a century old, it seems we may never definitively know what happened to Mary Elizabeth Eden's that night during the holiday horror. Oftentimes I will search for other stories similar to the main one that I have featured on that particular podcast to also include. I recently came across another school explosion that occurred just a few years after the Babswitch fire that I will talk about. However, this one is very different in how it began, but the results were just as deadly. In fact, it is still referred to today as the deadliest school massacre in United States history. This occurred on May 18, 1927, in the unincorporated community of Bath, Michigan. Bath is located close to Lansing, with a population at the time of just 300 adults. At approximately 8:45 a.m., there were explosions heard on a farm near town. Volunteer firefighters rushed to the scene. They climbed through a broken farmhouse window to search for survivors. When they found no one inside, they started to move what furniture they could outside before the flames filled the living room. They also found some explosives in the house, which they quickly picked up and carried outside. The firefighters then watched a man, presumably the owner of the house, get in his truck. The man then had an ominous comment for the firefighters before he left. He told them they should get to the school, and then he drove off. It would soon be evident what he was referring to. Classes would begin at the Bath Community School at 8:30 a.m. that day. However, at 8:45 a.m., around the same time as the farmhouse explosion, there was another explosion that apparently started in the basement of the school. Some firefighters who were on the way to the fire at the farmhouse heard the large explosion at the school and headed there instead. What they would find when they arrived resembled a war zone. Witnesses at the scene compared the explosion to an earthquake. The air was full of debris, desks, and books. It was even said some children were catapulted out of the building. There was total chaos, with frantic parents rushing to the scene after hearing the explosion, not believing what they found. The north wing of the school had collapsed. Witnesses say concerning the explosion, the floor went up and the roof came down. The edge of the roof had collapsed with several children pinned underneath. A man helping with the rescue efforts hurriedly drove to his house in hopes of getting a rope strong enough to pull the roof off of the trapped children. He would notice seeing the man whose farm had just burned to the ground driving into town towards the school. When he passed him, the man waved and had a big smile for the rescuer, which took him by surprise. This man, whose farm had burned down at the same time as the Bath School explosion, was 55-year-old Andrew Kehoe. About half an hour after the initial explosion, he would arrive at the school to view the carnage. Kehoe then summoned School Superintendent Emery Huck, who was at the scene, over to his truck to talk. Witnesses say they then saw the two men grappling over a rifle before Kehoe would aim it at his truck and fire, causing a second explosion. The second explosion was deadly as well. It spread debris over a large area and damaged cars half a block away. Kehoe would also die in the explosion, among others. After Kehoe's action, police had a place to start with their investigation. They arrived at the farmhouse rubble to investigate that explosion and to try to locate Andrew's wife, Nellie Kehoe. Police had searched throughout Michigan looking for her, as it was initially thought she was at a tuberculosis sanatorium. She had apparently been released and sent home on May 16th, 2 days before the fire. Sadly, her charred remains were found in the farmhouse the day after it burned. It appears Andrew Kehoe's wife was the first victim of his murderous rampage. All of the buildings on his farm were also destroyed in the explosions. His farm animals would also not survive the fire. Kehoe made sure of that. He also left a chilling final message on a homemade sign that he attached to a fence at his property. It read, "Criminals are made, not born." It was also discovered that Kehoe had filled the back seat of his truck with metal debris and bought a new set of tires to avoid breaking down when transporting the explosives. The final death toll of the two explosions at the Bath School was shocking. There were 38 victims of the first explosion, almost all of them children, and 5 more would die in the truck explosion. A 10-year-old victim would soon die of her injuries, and a 4th-grade girl would die 3 months after the bombing following hip surgery, making the total number of lives lost 45. There were also at least 58 people injured. Shocked and saddened at the events at Bath School, the rest of the country did what they could to help. In addition to local townspeople working tirelessly around the clock to search and hopefully rescue possible survivors, donations poured in. In a few weeks, the Red Cross received $5,284 to go towards the victim's funeral. That is the equivalent to over $92,000 by today's standards. Unfortunately, there were many sightseers who wanted to view the collapsed school as well as the burned-out farm. There were 3 full days of burials, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, in the town to lay the victims to rest. It is reported that over 100,000 vehicles passed through the town on Saturday alone. Opinions were mixed on whether it was for sympathy or simply morbid curiosity. Attention from the tragedy in Bath would soon leave the headlines, however, as Charles Lindbergh's transatlantic crossing would soon take over the national spotlight. I don't want to focus the story on Kehoe because he is a ruthless killer, but I will talk a little about his early life and about possible theories as to why he orchestrated this unspeakable act of violence. They tend to vary somewhat depending on which source you read, but I'll mention the ones that seem to be the most agreed upon. Kehoe had studied electrical engineering at Michigan State College and later moved to St. Louis to work as an electrician. There are vague reports that sometime around this time he suffered a head injury in a fall and was either semi-conscious or in a coma for several weeks. He was said to be frugal, hard to get along with, and complained often about taxes. In 1947, he was the Bath Consolidated School Board treasurer. In April of 1926, a year before the explosion, he lost the election for Bath Township clerk. He then found out in June of that year that foreclosure proceedings were starting on his farm. His wife was also sick with tuberculosis, and the couple had mounting medical bills because of it. It was thought he then put his diabolical plan into motion in the fall of 1926. He was an experienced electrician and was hired by the school board in November to make some repairs on the school's lighting system. This gave him ample time to hide the dynamite and pyritol all around the school while he was there without alerting anyone. Neighbors would state that Kehoe started buying large amounts of pyritol and dynamite in mid-1926. However, back then it was not uncommon for farmers to purchase those items for excavation and burning debris. The neighbors would also hear explosions at Kehoe's property, with one even referring to him as the dynamite farmer. It was discovered after the bombing that a large amount of dynamite had been stolen from a nearby bridge construction site, and Kehoe was now suspected of the theft. During the investigation, it was revealed that Kehoe had rigged an alarm clock to set off the explosives at 8:45 a.m. that morning. Kehoe wasn't just planning for one explosion at the school, however. During the aftermath, another 500 pounds of explosives were found under the south end of the school that apparently was supposed to go off during the initial explosion. They also found a container of gasoline rigged with a tube in the basement. Speculation is that Kehoe hoped gasoline fumes would ignite from a spark and spray burning gasoline all throughout the basement. The explosion happened on the last day of the school year. It was apparent that Kehoe wanted to annihilate the entire school and everyone in it. After the fire was put out and all the rescues completed, then the cleanup began. Andrew Kehoe's sister claimed his body and buried him in a pauper's grave at a cemetery in St. John's, Michigan. Nellie Price Kehoe's family would bury her in a Lansing cemetery under her maiden name. The Kehoe farm was completely plowed to ensure that no explosives were hidden in the ground, and the land was sold at auction to pay off the mortgage. School would resume on September 5, 1927, and would be held that year in the Community Hall, Township Hall, and 2 retail buildings, with most of the surviving students returning to class. The damaged portion of the school was soon demolished. Lansing architect Warren Holmes donated construction plans, and Senator James Couzens presented a personal check for $75,000, which was equivalent to $1.3 million today, to the newly formed Bath Relief Fund to help with the construction of the new portion of the school. During the reconstruction, even more dynamite was found on the school property on no less than 3 separate occasions. The rebuilding was completed the next year, and the James Couzens Agricultural School was dedicated on August 18, 1928. In 1975, the Couzens building was demolished and the site was redeveloped as the James Couzens Memorial Park. In 2002, a bronze plaque would be added to a large stone in the park, listing all of the names of those killed in the tragedy. There has since been a documentary as well as a docu-series released with photos and interviews with survivors. In the district's middle school, there is a Bath School Museum which contains many items connected to the explosion. It is evident that although almost 100 years have now passed, the memory of that day is still strong and will always be an important part of the community's history. There really isn't much of a mystery as to what happened that day in Bath. An evil killer, frustrated by situations he was facing in his life, decided to end many very young lives. The amount of preparation and premeditation that he put forth to carry out his plan is, in a word, chilling. The incident is considered by some as an act of terrorism, and it is hard to fathom a mind so evil as to choose to punish innocent young people just beginning their lives. All we can really do is to continue to honor the victims and keep this story out there so their lives will not be forgotten. That concludes this podcast on the Bath Switch Fire and the Bath School bombing. If you enjoyed it, please leave me a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find me on Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, and iHeartRadio. I try to release a new episode every 2 weeks, and you can read all of my original articles as well as links to my most recent podcasts on my website at Lost and Found Blogs. I also now have a Patreon channel under Lost and Found Podcast with exclusive podcasts on little-known missing persons cases. You can reach me at Lost and Found Podcast at Yahoo. I also have social media pages titled under Lost and Found Blogs on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And remember that cold cases stay cold because their story stops getting told.